On the frosted edge of Thanksgiving weekend, 1989, a German shepherd burst through the woods of rural Washington, soaked, panting, alone. The leash dangled empty. The girl who had left with her, 18-year-old Mandy Stavik, had vanished into silence. By Monday, the Nooksack River answered with cruel gift. Mandy's body, carried downstream, the future she'd been building suddenly extinguished. The town grieved, then whispered. Was a stranger? A neighbor? Someone smiling across the pews on Sunday? Days became months, months became years, and suspicion turned into folklore. The only certainty lay sealed inside an envelope in an evidence locker. Fragments of DNA, patient as stone, waiting for a world clever enough to read them. 28 years later, science finally spoke. And when it did, the name it revealed was an outsider, but a man who had been there all along. There's something deeply unsettling about silence, especially when it comes from someone who never stopped talking. Mandy Stavik was that kind of girl. Laughter, chatter, a voice that seemed to turn even ordinary afternoons into warm little performances. And yet, on the day after Thanksgiving in 1989, the woods of rural Washington swallowed her whole. Picture this: a German shepherd named Kyra, soaked and shaking, emerges from the Nooksack River without Mandy. The dog had gone running with her, as she did every day. But Mandy was gone. No frantic calls, no trace of her, just a dog stare with an almost human kind of guilt, as if it knew what we didn't. Later, when Mandy's body was found downstream, every parent in Whatcom County stopped sleeping. The cruelest part? Everyone already knew Mandy. Small town lives like spiderwebs, sticky, tight, impossible to untangle. She was a golden girl, athletic, intelligent, beautiful. She represented safety, promise, and the kind of future small towns secretly cling to. When she vanished, the community didn't just lose a person. They lost their illusion that the world outside couldn't reach them. And then came the crueler part. The case froze. 28 long years of false starts, broken leads, whispered suspicions, and one glaring question burning behind every friendly wave and church gathering. Was her killer living among them? The answer was yes. And the only thing that finally dragged him into the light wasn't an eyewitness or a confession or even police brilliance. It was saliva, a smear of DNA that waited nearly 3 decades for science to catch up. A strand of truth hidden in the most ordinary of places, waiting to undo a mask of normalcy that had held for far too long. You want to talk about horror? It isn't monsters in the woods. It's the fact that Mandy's killer smiled at neighbors, played baseball, went to barbecues, and carried on with his life like nothing happened. Until one day, a cup of soda finish in thoughtless casualness ended it all. But to really understand a Mandy Stavik story, you can't just start with the DNA swab that cracked it. You have to go back to the cold autumn air, the desperate search parties, the town that thought it was too small for evil. You have to understand how a case like this could haunt generations, and why it still whispers lessons about trust, science, and the terrifying banality of evil. The late 1980s. That liminal space where the neon glow of the decade's optimism was beginning to dim, and the colder, more skeptical 1990s loomed just ahead. In rural Whatcom County, Washington, nestled near the Canadian border, time moved slower than in cities. The mountains pressing on either side, rivers cut sharp veins through farmland, and the people, farmers, mechanics, teachers, were bound together by a sense of community that can only exist where anonymity is impossible. This was a place where doors were rarely locked, where Thanksgiving meant entire households gathered in wood-paneled kitchens with turkeys steaming on plates and gossip circulating like an unofficial newspaper. If you were a teenager in the late 80s here, you probably knew the price of a gallon of gas, the exact length of your neighbor's driveway, and every face you'd ever pass in the grocery store. It was cozy, suffocating maybe, but above all it felt safe. But safe is always a performance. It's the costumed small towns where to convince themselves they're immune to the chaos beyond their borders. People watch national headlines about serial predators, high-profile disappearances, and DNA technology inching into criminal trials, but those belong to some other America. Whatcom County lived under the illusion that violence was something that happened elsewhere, and that's why Mandy's absence didn't just shatter a family. It cracked the veneer of the entire community. The woods suddenly weren't just woods anymore. The river wasn't just a backdrop for weekend fishing. Every rustling in the brush, every unfamiliar car creeping along the two-lane roads felt like a hidden threat. Parents stopped letting their daughters jog alone. Strangers were no longer just passing through. The cultural backdrop made the eventual investigation even more complex. This wasn't Los Angeles or New York, with sprawling police departments and forensic divisions stacked with specialists. This was a place where the sheriff might be the guy who'd fix your brakes last year, where the biggest crime most officers dealt with was a drunk fight outside a tavern. They weren't ready for something like Mandy. The national landscape, meanwhile, was shifting. In 1989, DNA evidence was still new, still controversial, still seen by many as science fiction more than science. Imagine knowing that salvation exists, an invisible fingerprint hiding in every drop of blood and spit, but also knowing your small-town budget and resources mean you're trapped in the dark ages. It was a strange crossroad, a community clinging to its wholesome identity, a family plunged into nightmare, and a justice system fumbling with tools it barely understood. Out of that tension, the Mandy Stavik story emerged, both ordinary in its grief and extraordinary in its eventual unraveling. Mandy Mae Stavik. Just saying her name feels like introducing the heroine of a story too bright for the grim ending she got. She was 18, on the hinge of adulthood, poised between small-town familiarity and the wide-open possibilities of the world. Mandy wasn't just well-liked. She was adored. Star athlete, top student, the kind of person whose yearbook would overflow with signatures begging her never to change. People called her a natural leader, but it wasn't the forced kind, the captain barking orders on a team bus. Mandy led with magnetism, a smile that seemed rehearsed by the universe itself, a voice that lifted everyone around her, and a kind of focus that made you believe she'd bend the future to her will. She was already enrolled at Central Washington University, the kind of place where the runway for her ambitions could finally expand. And yet, like so many young women in stories like this, her promise becomes almost painful to recount. Because when someone is stolen at their peak, we aren't just mourning who they were, we're haunted by who they could have been, the teacher she might have become, the family she might have raised, the decades of laughter she was supposed to still have. It's like someone tore a page out of the book while we were still reading, and now we keep flipping back, hoping it magically appears. Those who knew Mandy said she never seemed afraid. She ran along the rural roads with her family's dog, Kyra, every day, regardless of weather. The kind of ritual you do so often that it becomes invisible, safe through repetition, protected by routine. But routine is also the most dangerous trap. It tells predators where to wait. And maybe that's why this case still slices into people's bones 3 decades later. Mandy wasn't wandering into danger in some reckless adventure. She wasn't in a far-off city or lost in the chaos of nightlife. She was home, running on a road that carried her footsteps countless times before. And someone saw her there, not as a neighbor, not as a friend, not as the daughter everyone loved, but as prey. To understand the Mandy Stavik story, you have to first hold her in your mind, not as a victim, but as she was, a girl whose smile could melt through winter frost, whose ambition stretched further than the mountains that walled in her hometown, a girl who trusted her world enough to run straight into it. That trust would be her undoing. The Friday after Thanksgiving in 1989, should have been utterly forgettable. A lazy morning, leftover turkey sandwiches, the quiet lull before Christmas hysteria. For Mandy, it was routine. Lace-up sneakers, grab the leash and take Kyra, the family's German shepherd, out for a run. She told her mom she'd be back soon. She always was. But when Kyra came home alone, drenched and trembling, the air in the Stavik household collapsed into something heavy and alien. Dogs don't explain. They just look at you with eyes that carry too much weight. Her mother knew instantly that something was wrong. The leash was gone. The rhythm of Mandy's footsteps never echoed back on the gravel driveway. The first hours were chaos wrapped in denial. Maybe she twisted an ankle. Maybe she got distracted and stopped at a friend's. Maybe, please maybe, she'd be walking to the door any minute with that casual teenage "what's the big deal?" shrug. But Mandy didn't walk back through that door, and each minute stretched elastic and cruel until the panic became undeniable. The community mobilized quickly. This was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where volunteer search parties could be assembled in minutes. Neighbors scoured trails, fields, and the banks of the Nooksack River, calling her name as though sheer force of voice might pull her back. Flashlights cut through the dark, illuminating only fog and brush. Then, the unthinkable confirmation. 3 days later, Mandy's body was found in the river, about 6 miles downstream from her home. The sight burned itself into memories of those who discovered her. Too young, too vibrant, now reduced to the stillness of death. The river had carried her away, but someone had put her there. That's the fracture point. The moment when a missing persons case turns into something darker, heavier, irreversible. The Stavik's house, once noisy with teenage chatter, fell into a void of grief. The town that once bragged about its safety began to look sideways at itself. Every young woman in Whatcom County suddenly carried an invisible weight. If Mandy could vanish, so could they. And for investigators, the clock started ticking. The longer a case lingers, the harder it is to solve. But this wasn't just about solving. It was about trust. A predator had just carved their way into a community that thought itself untouchable. And the most terrifying part? That predator wasn't some shadowy outsider. It was almost certainly someone local. Someone who knew her routes, her habits, her routine. The silence Kyra returned with that day wasn't just absence. It was prophecy. What makes a mystery unbearable isn't always the absence of answers. It's the presence of too many. From the moment Mandy's body was pulled from the river, the theories began. Everyone had one, whispered in kitchens, murmured at gas stations, passed along pews on Sunday mornings. In a small town, speculation spreads like a second contagion. The police did their best with what they had, but the best was frustratingly small. No cameras on the roads, no cell phones to ping, no forensics ready to whisper truths from a trace of saliva. What they did have were leads that slipped through their fingers like wet stones. Witnesses thought they saw Mandy running. Others thought they saw a truck. Some swore she was chased. But eyewitness memory is fickle. It bends, breaks, reshapes itself under fear. And then there was the dog, Kyra. She was the only living witness to what happened out there, but she couldn't speak. Investigators could only imagine her frantic barking, her failed attempts to stop what happened, her long swim back home with loss in her fur. A loyal protector reduced to silence. Rumors curdled quickly into paranoia. Parents told daughters to jog only in groups. Strangers were suddenly cataloged, their every move dissected. But when days became weeks and weeks became months, the momentum of panic gave way to something worse: resignation. It's almost grotesque how quickly humans normalize tragedy. Mandy's name, once spoken with urgency, began fading into the background hum of grief. For Mandy's family, though, the mystery wasn't abstract. It was suffocating. Her mother, Mary, kept pressing for answers, refusing to let the case drift into the unsolved abyss. That refusal gave her a reputation. Relentless, unwilling to forgive the silence around her. Imagine waking every morning knowing the person who killed your daughter might be shaking hands at the grocery store, laughing at the same little league game, blending perfectly into the wallpaper of your life. And the truth is, they were right. He was. But in those early years, no one could prove it. The killer's identity hung over the community like an open secret that nobody could name. Suspicion fell on classmates, neighbors, even family friends. But suspicion without evidence is just poison. It corrodes relationships, dissolves trust, leaves scars deeper than confession ever could. The real mystery, then, wasn't just who killed Mandy. It was how a small town could survive under the weight of knowing that evil had already crossed its threshold, sat at its tables, maybe even prayed in its churches. If you've ever watched a small-town investigation unfold, you know the rhythm. Hope flares, leads collapse, suspect appear, then vanish back into the crowd. The Mandy Stavik case was no different, except the stakes were unbearable because the victim wasn't a stranger. She was the girl next door. Detectives combed through Mandy's circle. Friends, classmates, ex-boyfriends, anyone who might have known her routines. It was textbook policing, but also a minefield. Every interview risked ripping apart friendships, sowing gossip, setting suspicion on innocent shoulders. Some young men were whispered about for years, their reputations bruised simply because they once walked Mandy home from school. The theories ran like wildfire. Some thought it was a crime of passion, an angry boyfriend unable to let go. Others whispered about strangers on the highway, drifters who could vanish as easily as they arrived. But the river told a different story. Mandy hadn't just stumbled, hadn't just drowned. There were signs of struggle. Someone had forced her there. Forensics in 1989 couldn't sing the way they do now, but they still whispered. Investigators collected biological samples, tiny fragments of truth stored in envelopes and refrigerators, waiting for the day someone would learn to read them properly. Back then, DNA testing was a newborn technology, too expensive, too fragile, and too controversial to lean on fully. Imagine holding the key to a locked door, but not having the hand strength to turn it. That was the state of the case. The community kept circling names. People who didn't fit in. People who were too quiet, too strange, or maybe just too conveniently available. But without evidence, suspicion is just theater. Theories bloomed, then rotted. A couple of locals even claimed they saw Mandy with a mystery man in a car, but the descriptions were vague, almost ghost-like, and led nowhere. And still, through the years, the evidence sat. The biological samples, the unprocessed truth. Detectives returned to them periodically, like scratching at an old wound, always hoping signs would catch up. And in time it would. But first, the case had to endure decades of false hope and endless silence. Theories outlived leads. Neighbors outlived reputations. Mandy's mother outlived her daughter. And somewhere in Whatcom County, the killer outlived suspicion. He built a family. He went to work. He laughed in living rooms where people whispered his name, but never dared accuse him to his face. Because monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they borrow the light, wear like a second skin, and walk right among us. For 28 years, the Mandy Stavik case was a wound that wouldn't close. It festered quietly, the kind of open sore everyone in town learned to live with but never stopped scratching. Detectives aged out of force. Boxes of evidence collected dust, and every Thanksgiving the Stavik family sat down to dinner with an empty chair that screamed louder than words. And then an almost absurd twist. The kind of twist you dismiss as lazy writing if it appeared in a crime drama. The suspect wasn't dragged out of hiding by confessions or some cryptic diary or even a slip of the tongue. He was undone by a soda can. Timothy Bass, a local man, ordinary in every way. He lived in the same area Mandy did. He was 22 when she died, close enough in age to know her, old enough to prey on her. He'd always been a shadowy name floating at the edges of suspicion, but without evidence, he was untouchable. For decades, he blended in, raising kids, holding down jobs, mowing his lawn like everyone else. But here's where human arrogance always cracks the mask. Bass refused to provide a voluntary DNA sample when police finally knocked on his door years later. That refusal was the reddest flag in a sea of beige. Detectives couldn't force him, not without probable cause. But they didn't need his permission. They just needed his trash. A co-worker unknowingly became the hinge of fate. Bass finished a can of soda, tossed it aside. That aluminum cylinder became the Pandora's box of the entire investigation. Collected quietly, tested discreetly. It carried the one thing Bass could never scrub away: himself. The results? A match. After decades of blind searching, the DNA from Mandy's case clicked perfectly into place with Bass's discarded saliva. It was the kind of revelation that splits time into before and after. Suddenly, the case wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a confrontation with the unbearable truth that the predator had been in plain sight, shaking hands, cracking jokes, hiding behind normalcy for nearly 3 decades. That moment was a breakdown, the point where all the whispers solidified into something undeniable. The silence of Whatcom County was broken, and Bass's mask dissolved under the bright, merciless gaze of science. There's irony so sharp it cuts here. Bass spent decades controlling the narrative by saying nothing, by being ordinary. And in the end, it wasn't a grand gesture that exposed him. It was a sip of soda, a careless, mundane, everyday act that opened the door to everything he had tried to bury. When the DNA results came back, there was no wiggle room, no alternate interpretation, no legal gymnastics left for Timothy Bass to hide behind. The match was overwhelming. In a single stroke, nearly 3 decades of speculation collapsed into certainty. The courtroom became the stage where the certainty was performed, and the audience, Mandy's family, the townspeople, even strangers following the headlines, sat there with a kind of silent, furious anticipation only true justice can provoke. Bass tried, of course. His defense clawed at every weak thread they could find. He claimed the DNA proved only that he'd had a relationship with Mandy, a consensual one, but the story buckled under its own absurdity. No one, absolutely no one, could remember ever seeing them together. Mandy, bright and ambitious, confiding in friends and family about her life, had never once mentioned him. For his claim to be true, it would mean she'd hidden an entire relationship from everyone she trusted most. The jury didn't buy it. And here's where psychological horror sharpens. Bass had lived a double life so flawlessly that, for years, he wasn't just unsuspected. He was practically invisible. He went to barbecues, paid bills, tucked his children into bed at night. He carried the secret of Mandy's death in his chest like a ticking bomb, and no one heard the sound. In 2019, Bass was convicted of Mandy's murder and sentenced to nearly 27 years in prison. 27 years for 28 years of silence. It feels almost mathematical, doesn't it? A sentence carved just barely short of the time he spent walking free. But does a conviction really bring resolution? For Mandy's family, the answer was complicated. Yes, Bass was behind bars, stripped of the normal life he never deserved. Yes, the case file was closed, the murderer identified, the community's suspicion vindicated. But Mandy was still gone. Her future, her laughter, her presence, those were never coming back. And the lingering questions fester. Why her? Was it opportunity? Obsession? A single predatory impulse? Or had Bass stalked her, day after day, rehearsing the crime in his mind before finally acting? The trial didn't unearth those answers. Bass himself offered no confession, no apology, no insight into the abyss that made him act. He left the truth sealed inside himself, choosing silence as his final weapon. So yes, justice was served. But resolution? Resolution implies healing, closure, a neatly tied bow. And the Mandy Stavik story was never neat. It ended in prison bars and courtroom applause, but also ended with a hollow echo. The why of it all, forever unanswered. After the gavel fell and Timothy Bass was locked away, Whatcom County exhaled for the first time in nearly 3 decades. But relief doesn't erase history. It only rearranges it. The Stavik case had carved itself into the DNA of the community just as deeply as Bass's saliva had carved itself into the evidence bag. For Mandy's mother, Mary, the aftermath was bittersweet. She had lived nearly 30 years under the suffocating weight of uncertainty. Every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday carried the shadow of unanswered questions. To finally hear a jury declare her daughter's killer guilty was a victory, but one laced with exhaustion. Mary had become a warrior, a constant voice reminding the world that her daughter mattered. That persistence forced the system to keep circling back until science finally caught up. Without her, the case might have simply rotted in a file drawer. The case also rewrote the playbook for local law enforcement. It showed that patience, decades of patience, paired with advancing technology, could tear through even the most stubborn mysteries. Investigators everywhere learn a lesson: never throw anything away. What sits useless in 1989 might scream the truth in 2017. It was a living advertisement for the power of DNA. Proof that time isn't always the enemy of justice. Sometimes it's the accomplice. But there's a darker legacy, too. The community could no longer pretend it was insulated from violence. They had lived beside a killer for nearly 30 years. Shared grocery aisles, Little League bleachers, maybe even Christmas parades. That realization didn't just crack trust, it obliterated it. If Bass could pass as harmless for decades, who else could? And then there's a cultural echo. The Mandy Stavik story became one of those cases people tell to warn daughters, to remind neighbors, to justify locks on doors that once stayed open. Her name stopped being just a girl's name. It became a parable about routine turned fatal, about predators who were ordinary faces, about the cruel unpredictability of life. Yet the legacy isn't entirely despair. Mandy's story pushed conversations about forensic science forward, helped prove the necessity of preserving evidence, and show that persistence can outlast silence. Her absence reshaped her community. But in that reshaping, it left tools that may save someone else's life in the future. Every small town tells itself it's immune to tragedy, until it isn't. And Whatcom County will never again tell that lie. There's a line I can't stop circling back to. Evil doesn't always arrive with a mask. Sometimes it wears a baseball cap, carries a lunchbox, and smiles at you across a break room. Timothy Bass didn't crawl out of nightmare. He lived next door. That's the most unsettling part of the Mandy Stavik story. Not the brutality of the act itself, but the banality of the years that followed. Think about it. For nearly 3 decades, the town sat around Thanksgiving tables, passing cranberry sauce and laughing, while just a few miles away, the man who silenced Mandy Stavik carved turkey with his own family. He tucked his kids in at night, knowing exactly what he'd done. He built a life on top of her death, like pouring fresh concrete over a grave. And everyone else walked on it, never realizing what lay beneath. Science finally cracked his disguise, but technology can't explain motive. Why Mandy? Why that day? Why a girl whose future was just beginning to unfold? Bass never said. He took the why with him, burying it beneath the same smirk he wore for 30 years. So we're left with a paradox. Justice was served. The murderer was named, tried, and locked away. And yet the case doesn't feel clean. It never will. Because the hole left by Mandy isn't one of verdict and fill. Her absence still presses against the town like a bruise, visible every time someone remembers the sound of Kyra splashing out of the Nooksack River alone. Maybe that's the final cruelty. Not just the crime, but the silence afterward. The way time forces you to keep living in a place that's no longer innocent. The way evil doesn't just take a life. It rewrites the story of an entire community. And yet, Mandy's name survives. Not as a footnote, not as another unsolved mystery swallowed by history, but as proof that even after decades of darkness, truth can claw its way back into the light. The question that lingers is the one you'll carry after the story ends. If it took 28 years to unmask Timothy Base, how many other masks are still intact? How many other smiles hide something monstrous, waiting for the day science finally calls their bluff? That's not closure. That's the echo of reality, and it's louder than any verdict. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.